So, this happened to me about a year ago, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was driving back home after a late shift at work. The road was desolate, and the only light came from my car's headlights, slicing through the thick darkness. I was halfway through a long stretch of road when I saw him. A figure stood by the side of the road, his thumb sticking out in that universal gesture. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but there was something about this guy that seemed desperate. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like straight out of the 70s, bell-bottom jeans, a faded band t-shirt, and a leather jacket. His hair was long and shaggy, and he looked like he hadn't shaved in days. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Where are you heading?" I asked. "Just a few miles up the road," he replied, his voice low and raspy. "Could really use a lift, man." I hesitated for a moment, but then unlocked the door. "Hop in." He got in, and I couldn't help but notice the chill that accompanied him. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees as soon as he closed the door. I chalked it up to the night air and started driving. We rode in silence for a while. He stared out the window, not saying a word, and I began to feel a bit uneasy. Finally, to break the tension, I asked, "So, what's your story? Why are you out here at this hour?" He turned to me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Just trying to get home," he said. "Been a long night." Something about his tone made my skin crawl, but I tried to shake it off. "Yeah, I get that. Where exactly do you live?" "Just up ahead," he replied vaguely, and went back to staring out the window. As we drove, I noticed something odd. The road seemed different, like we were driving through a part I'd never seen before, even though I took this route every night. The trees seemed to close in, and a thick fog started to form, making it harder to see. Suddenly, the hitchhiker spoke again. "You know, this road's got a history," he said quietly. "Oh yeah." I tried to sound casual, but my heart was pounding. "Yeah," he continued. "There's a story about a guy who died here years ago. They say he still haunts this stretch, looking for a ride home." I laughed nervously. "You trying to scare me?" He didn't laugh. He just looked at me, his eyes piercing. "It's not a joke," he said. "People have seen him." We drove in silence for a bit longer, the atmosphere growing more oppressive by the minute. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "This is my stop." I pulled over, and he got out. "Thanks for the ride," he said, and started walking into the fog. I watched him disappear into the mist, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief that he was gone. I put the car in drive and sped off, eager to get home. But here's the thing. When I glanced at the passenger seat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The seat was completely dry. No sign of anyone having sat there. And then I saw it, an old, crumpled newspaper lying on the floor. The headline read, "Local man dies in hit and run, haunts road where he died." The picture was of the hitchhiker I'd just picked up. My hands shook as I drove, my mind racing. I'd heard stories about ghost hitchhikers, but I never believed them until now. I don't take that road anymore. I'd rather take the long way around than risk another encounter with whatever that was. So, yeah, that's my story. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but it happened, and it still haunts me to this day. It was around midnight, and I was driving home after a long day at work. The roads were empty, and I was looking forward to getting home and crashing into bed. As I approached an intersection, a car suddenly cut me off, causing me to slam on my brakes. My heart pounded in my chest as I honked my horn and flashed my headlights at the driver in frustration. The car in front slowed down, and I could see the driver glaring at me through the rearview mirror. I muttered a few choice words under my breath and decided to take the next turn to avoid any further confrontation. As I turned onto a dimly lit back road, I noticed the car following me. My annoyance quickly turned to unease. I tried to shake the feeling and continued driving, but the car stayed right on my tail. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I took another turn, and then another, but the car followed every move I made. Panic set in. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no other cars or houses in sight. I decided to try and outrun them, pushing my car to its limits. The road twisted and turned, and I navigated the curves with a growing sense of dread. The headlights behind me grew brighter, and I realized they were getting closer. Suddenly, my phone rang, startling me. I fumbled to answer it while keeping my eyes on the road. It was my friend Mike. "Hey, where are you?" he asked. "Mike, listen, I think someone's following me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What, are you serious?" he replied, concern evident in his voice. "Yeah, I don't know what to do. They're right behind me, and I'm in the middle of nowhere." "Okay, stay calm. Try to get to a populated area or find a place to pull over where there are people around." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "All right, I'll try." I took another sharp turn, hoping to shake the pursuer, but they were relentless. My car skidded slightly on the gravel road, and I fought to regain control. The car behind me was now dangerously close, their headlights blinding me in the rearview mirror. Out of nowhere, the road split into two. I took the left path without thinking, praying it would lead me to safety. The road narrowed, and trees loomed on either side, their branches casting eerie shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The car was still there, but now it seemed more erratic, swerving slightly as it followed. I took another sharp turn, and suddenly, the road ended in a small clearing. I slammed on the brakes, my car coming to a screeching halt. I looked around frantically, realizing I had nowhere to go. The other car stopped at the entrance to the clearing, its headlights illuminating my car like a spotlight. I could barely make out the driver as they got out of the car and started walking toward me. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the glint of something metallic in their hand. Panic surged through me, and I reached for my phone to call Mike back, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. The figure approached, and I could see their face now, twisted with rage. They raised the object in their hand, and I realized it was a tire iron. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Just as the person reached my car, I heard another sound, sirens in the distance. The driver froze, their expression changing from anger to fear. They turned and ran back to their car, speeding off into the night. Moments later, a police car pulled into the clearing. The officer got out and approached me, asking if I was okay. I explained what had happened, and they assured me they'd do everything they could to find the person. As I drove home, my hands still trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I knew I'd never forget that night, and the sense of terror that came with being pursued by a stranger with deadly intent. I have a story for you that happened to me while I was driving. It was on October 4, 2017. I remember the date clearly because it was the day before my son was born. At that time, my wife had been admitted to the hospital due to severe hypertension caused by pregnancy. She had been in the hospital for a week, and during that week, I was driving back and forth between the hospital and my home. It was 2 a.m. when I was driving on a highway that cuts through almost half of the city. As I was navigating one of its curves, I saw a person by the side of the road and almost hit them. I swerved sharply, nearly running off the road. My heart was pounding as I tried to regain control of the car. I was shaken, but I managed to get to the hospital. Once I parked, I took a moment to process what had just happened. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. That's when a thought struck me that left me completely unsettled. Those familiar with Tijuana will probably understand, and for those who aren't, I suggest looking it up on Google Maps. The Via Rapida I mentioned is built through a cemetery. When it was being constructed, the machinery unearthed graves, and the bones of the deceased were visible, literally splitting the cemetery in two. On one side of the curve I mentioned is a place known as the Common Grave, where the remains of unrecognized people or those whose families couldn't afford a proper burial are placed. On the other side is a ravine, a rocky cliff. So, a question popped into my mind. What was that person doing on the highway in a place that doesn't make any sense to pass through? It's also worth mentioning that there have been multiple accidents on this curve, some of them fatal. After sitting there for a few minutes, I decided to shake it off and head inside to see my wife. She was resting peacefully, and I didn't want to disturb her, so I sat by her side, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The next few days were a blur with the arrival of my son, but the image of that person on the highway kept nagging at me. One evening, a week after the incident, I found myself driving down the same stretch of road again. It was late, and the city was eerily quiet. As I approached the curve, my headlights illuminated the same spot where I had seen the person before. My heart skipped a beat when I saw him again, standing in the exact same place. I pulled over, my curiosity getting the better of me. I got out of the car, my breath visible in the chilly night air. The figure was still there, unmoving. As I walked closer, I realized something was off. The person seemed to be wearing old, tattered clothing, and there was an unsettling stillness about them. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. But there was no response. I moved closer, and as I did, the figure slowly turned to face me. My blood ran cold when I saw their face. It was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were hollow, empty sockets. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. I turned to run back to my car. Once I got to my car, I turned back and the figure was gone. The spot where they had stood was now empty, as if they had never been there. I drove home that night, with the image of that ghostly face burned into my mind. I did some research and discovered that many of the accidents on that curve involved drivers swerving to avoid a figure standing by the road. Some say it's the restless spirit of someone buried in the common grave, seeking recognition or closure. I don't drive that road at night anymore, and I can't shake the feeling that I witnessed something beyond explanation. It's a story I rarely share, but every time I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. My mom and I were driving home, late one winter night after visiting my grandparents. It was pitch black and icy, the kind of night where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. As we drove along a rural road, my mom turned on the high beams to see better, switching them off whenever another car approached. Suddenly, we found ourselves behind a black car that was acting erratically. The driver kept speeding up and then abruptly slowing down, making it impossible for us to pass safely. Frustrated and nervous, my mom kept a safe distance, but the situation quickly escalated. The black car came to a sudden stop, blocking the road. Before we could react, a huge, burly man jumped out, sprinting toward our car with something in his hand. My heart raced as I saw the fury in his eyes. He reached our car and began pounding on my mom's window with a large flashlight, yelling and swearing. "Turn off your damn high beams," he screamed, the flashlight smashing against the glass with each word. My mom tried to stay calm, yelling back at him to get lost, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I was terrified, certain that he was going to break the window and hurt us. Just then, a car behind us began honking loudly. The man hesitated, glancing back at the noise. Realizing he was drawing attention, he snarled one last threat before storming back to his car and speeding off into the night. Shaking, my mom called my dad, who drove around for hours looking for the man, but he was long gone. We never found out who he was or why he reacted so violently. The memory of his rage and the sound of that flashlight against the window haunted me for years. It was a terrifying reminder of how quickly a routine drive can turn dangerous. It's been over 20 years, but the memory still sends chills down my spine. Like it happened just yesterday. I used to work crazy overtime hours, way out in the sticks, far from home. My shifts started at 7 a.m. and often went till 9 p.m., sometimes even pushing till 11. This grind went on for a good year or two. Looking back, I'm sure the exhaustion played tricks on my mind, but there's one night I can't explain away. It was close to midnight, and I was driving home on those lonely back roads. There were hardly any cars around, just the hum of my engine and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I was bone tired, eyes heavy, struggling to stay awake. The monotonous rhythm of the tires on the pavement was almost hypnotic. That's when it happened. I started nodding off, the lines on the road blurring together. Suddenly, I snapped awake, my heart pounding. On the side of the road, I saw people, dozens of them, just standing there, staring. It was like a crowd had gathered out of nowhere. They were all dressed differently, some in old-fashioned clothes, others in more modern attire. But there was something off about them, something that made my skin crawl. As I got closer, they vanished. Just like that, one moment there, the next gone, swallowed by the darkness. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But then it happened again. Another group, farther down the road, and again, they disappeared as I approached. My pulse quickened, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I realized these weren't ordinary people. They were spirits, ghosts of those who had died in accidents on that very road. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, my car veered off the road. The noise snapped me back to reality. I yanked the wheel, managing to steer back onto the pavement just in time. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I was convinced those spirits were trying to warn me of the danger. Maybe they were trying to save me from sharing their fate. I made it home that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something otherworldly had intervened. For years, I kept that experience to myself, unsure if it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks or some survival instinct kicking in. But now, sitting here and recounting it, I know deep down that what I saw was real. Those spirits were there, watching, warning. And every time I drive that road, even now, I can't help but glance at the side of the road, half expecting to see them again. So there it is, my story, shared for the first time. Believe it or not, it's the truth as I remember it. That night, over 20 years ago, changed me. It made me a believer in things beyond our understanding, and every time I think about it, those chills return, reminding me of the night I saw the spirits on the road.